Why does Trump and JD Vance seem to despise Europe? It's not just a casual opinion. They've made it clear in private and, well, in public. Leaked messages from a secret chat revealed their shocking views, from military strikes to trade. They believe Europe is taking advantage of the US.
It's not Russia, it's not China, it's not any other external actor. The retreat of Europe from some of its most fundamental values shared with the United States of America.
But is it that simple? This video will explain why these leaders see Europe as freeloaders. We'll dig into the leaked conversations, their past statements, and the bigger geopolitical forces at play. Stick with us and you might just rethink everything you thought you knew about US-Europe relations. In March 2025, a surprising leak shook the political world. Jeffrey Goldberg, editor-in-chief of The Atlantic, accidentally got added to a Signal chat.
Because on Tuesday, the President of the United States said there's nothing classified or sensitive in the emails, in the texts,
filled with high-level US officials. Among them were Vice President JD Vance, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, and Secretary of State Marco Rubio. The group was discussing sensitive military action, like airstrikes on the Houthi rebels in Yemen. However, what grabbed attention was their harsh comments about Europe. Vance and others criticized Europe for relying on the US for protection and military presence. Now, these messages showed an uncomfortable truth. Trump's inner circle views Europe as a burden, not a partner. This leak raised more than national security concerns. It revealed deep geopolitical tensions within the Trump administration. At the heart of Trump and Vance's frustration with Europe is the idea of freeloading. Now, they believe that Europe benefits from the US's military power and economic strength without giving enough back. This complaint is especially loud when it comes to NATO. The US has spent more time on defense than more European countries, yet Trump argues that Europeans expect the US to take care of its security.
The European Union is very, very nasty. They sue our companies. Apple was forced to pay $16 billion on a case that, very much like my cases that I won.
This isn't just about money. It's about responsibility. Trump and Vance think European nations should contribute more to defense spending or support US-led missions. The frustration doesn't stop there. Trump has also pointed to Europe's trade imbalance with the US, which he views as another form of freeloading. European nations are seen as relying on American consumers to buy their goods, while American products don't get the same attention. To them, Europe takes more than it gives. This freeloading mentality ties into the larger issue of global influence. For Trump, the US should be getting something substantial in return for its support of Europe. When they don't, it feels like a one-way street. Resentment grows, leading to sharper criticism and tensions in US-European relations. For Trump and his team, it's about fairness, and they feel that Europe isn't pulling its weight. Now, the Signal chart revealed some pointing complaints from Trump's team about Europe. JD Vance, for example, criticized Europe for relying on the US Navy to secure global trade routes, while the US plays a key role in safeguarding the seas. Vance argued that Europe benefits from this protection without contributing fairly. Another complaint was Europe's heavy dependence on the US for military presence in the Middle East, particularly around the Persian Gulf. The US military is there to maintain stability, but for Trump and Vance, this is a service Europe isn't paying for. Now, another key issue is the NATO defense burden. Trump and his allies believe Europe isn't carrying its fair share of the defense load. Now, while the US spends billions on military operations, European countries fall short of meeting NATO's defense spending targets. In their eyes, this is a form of freeloading. The resentment grows when they see European countries relying on American strength while contributing little to the cause. These complaints highlight the deep frustration within the Trump administration towards Europe's role in global security. Trump and Vance's criticism of Europe ignoring a key point: US military spending isn't just about helping others. America's interests largely drive it. Now, the US spends heavily on defense because it benefits the nation, not out of generosity to Europe. One reason is the influence of domestic military lobbies. These groups push for a powerful military, supporting jobs, industries, and national security. Additionally, the US military presence in key regions like the Middle East serves broader American goals. Now, the US uses its military to control critical global trade routes, especially in places like the Persian Gulf. This helps maintain leverage over other countries, especially rivals like Iran and China. Keeping the seas open ensures the US can pressure these nations without directly confronting. Now, the US also maintains a strong military to counter global threats. With China's rise as a superpower, America needs a strong military presence to maintain its position as the world's dominant force. For the US, military spending is tied to maintaining global power. Europe may benefit from this presence, but America's primary concern is its strategic advantage, not Europe's protection. The US isn't doing this for free. It's about securing American interests first and foremost. Trump's complaint about Europe's trade deficit with the US focuses on the idea
Charge us tremendously higher tariffs than we charge them.
that Europe is taking advantage of American consumers. He argues that the EU sells more goods to the US than it buys, creating an imbalance, but this view misses the bigger picture. The US trade deficit is not simply because Europe is freeloading. A key factor is the role of the US dollar as the world's reserve currency. Because the dollar is in such high demand globally, imports are cheaper for the US. Other countries, including Europe, buy dollars to hold in reserves or trade, which creates a flow of goods into the US. This leads to more imports and in turn a trade deficit. The dollar's dominance results from decades of US policy aimed at making the dollar the go-to currency for global trade. While the trade imbalance may seem unfair, it's not just Europe taking advantage. The US benefits from the dollar reserve status because it allows the government to borrow more easily and allows Americans to enjoy cheaper imports. Europe did not force this policy, so while Trump sees the deficit as Europe's fault, it's more about global economic structures. So why these complaints aren't fully justified? While Trump and Vance's complaints about Europe's freeloading may sound convincing, they don't tell the whole story. For example, the US military presence in Europe and the Middle East isn't done purely for the benefit of Europe. The US is there because it serves its strategic goals, such as countering threats from countries like China and Iran. Now, these military commitments help maintain US global dominance, not just European security. Now, the trade deficit is more complicated than simply Europe exploring the US. The dollar's role as the world's reserve currency plays a huge part. Now, this policy has allowed the US to import more than its exports, benefiting from cheaper goods. Europe is not to blame for this economic structure. It results from long-standing American policies. Europe has often supported US goals, from economic sanctions against Russia to military actions in the Middle East. Now, the relationship is not one-sided, even if Trump's team sees it that way. Europe may not always meet the US expectations, but the picture is far more complex than the freeloading narrative suggests. Trump and JD Vance's frustration with Europe comes down to one key belief. Europe is freeloading off the US. They argue that Europe isn't pulling its weight in defense, spending, or trade. However, this view oversimplifies the situation. The US military presence and the trade deficit serve America's strategic interests, not just Europe's needs. Now, while Europe benefits from US power, the US gains from its global dominance and economic policies. The relationship between the US and Europe is more complex than Trump's team lets on. It's about self-interest, not just freeloading.